So let's talk about model interpretation for these English Anaphoric 1 learning models. And again, there are two general approaches. One is to filter the direct evidence, to ignore some of the information in the direct evidence. And the other option was to learn from a broader set of data. And so both these models were algorithmic level implementation. So they were following a step-by-step procedure that children might reasonably be able to follow. And they were evaluated on whether they matched 18-month-old looking preferences from the Lids, Waxman, and Friedman 2003 study. And so both, it turns out, were successful at generating the behavior, which is great because then we can look inside the modeled learners and see what the underlying representations were that allowed them to produce this behavior that matched 18-month-old behavior. So let's look first at the approaches that filtered the direct evidence, that ignored some of the information in that direct evidence and just learned from a subset in their acquisitional intake. So what happened was they ended up with very adult-like representations for how to interpret anaphoric 1. They converged on the idea that its antecedent ought to be category noun bar, which is the adult representation, and in the context of look a pretty kitty, do you see another one, they picked the antecedent to be another pretty kitty, just like kids did. However, in order to have this knowledge, to acquire this knowledge, these model learners required additional situational context to be present. In particular, they needed it to be true that whenever you said something like, look a pretty kitty, oh, look another one, that there were a lot of alternative options so that it would be a real big suspicious coincidence that the referent just happened to be pretty if pretty wasn't actually relevant, if it wasn't actually included in the antecedent. So let's just look at that in terms of our Bayesian inference, right? So if you have two hypotheses, spaces one is the referent, the antecedent is pretty kitty, right? So the referent is just the pretty one. And the other is that the antecedent is kitty, and so you can have lots of other possible things, right, in that hypothesis space. And let's just say you know of 5 other things, right, that could be true. So we create 2 hypotheses, one of which is a subset of the other one, which is larger, the subset is smaller, the other one is larger, right? So H1 is our smaller one. So let's look at this in terms of Bayesian inference. On prior, let's say we don't have any push or pull towards either one. Before we see anything, either of these 2 hypotheses is equally likely. But the likelihood, again, is what's doing our work, right? So in hypothesis 1, if you only know of one pretty kitty, if that's the property it has, right, there's a 1 out of 1 chance that you meant to refer to that kitty, right, and you use pretty to do it, right? But for hypothesis 2, if kitty is actually the antecedent, then it's just by chance that you picked the pretty one. You could have picked any of the other 5 featured kitties, right, that are there. So your likelihood of referring to that one kitty is just 1 out of 5, much lower likelihood, right? So if we do our posterior, again, we use our proportion, then we end up with hypothesis 2 being 5 times less likely than hypothesis 1. So you get that push towards the antecedent being pretty kitty when a pretty kitty is present, and there are lots of other things you could have referred to, right? So you need to have lots of alternative options in order to get this kind of learner to work where you're filtering down, ignoring some information that's present. So in that sense, it's maybe a slightly less robust strategy because we don't know if that's actually true in children's experiences, right? This is just something that would need to be true in order for this learning strategy to work. Now, the alternative approach was to say, okay, let's not ignore anything, but let's add in some additional stuff about like how pronouns work in general. And what happened when you leveraged this broader set of data for the acquisitional intake is you ended up with a learner that had immature representations. That is, it had the right category of noun bar and the right interpretation of pretty kitty, but only in certain linguistic contexts, in particular one where the antecedent, the potential antecedent, where you mentioned a property like pretty, right, which happens to be exactly the scenario that Lids, Waxman, and Friedman used. So in that scenario, these 18-month-olds very likely would have had 1 being category noun bar, just as they thought. But in fact, in other contexts, when there isn't a modifier present, look a kitty, oh look another one, right? There are 2 syntactic options for kitty. It could be a noun or a noun bar. And this learner said, well, in that case, let kitty be the antecedent, let kitty be a noun, let one's category be a noun, right? So it's not quite right because adults actually don't do that. And we'll see in a minute why that is. But this learner does that behavior, does that acquired knowledge for pretty much any situational context. So in some sense, it's more robust as a strategy. It doesn't depend on certain things being true. So what we take away from this is this modeling approaches. We have two concrete proposals for how English children learn the knowledge that they do by 18 months. And this also motivates future experimental work that can distinguish which of them is actually right. So in particular, there are certain contexts where we can like this one, actually, I'll read to you. So this kitty likes the cup of milk, but not the one of water. And most English adults hate this. They generally don't like it because it forces one to be category noun, and they generally want one to be category noun bar, right? But we don't know what 18-month-olds do, right? When do 18-month-olds have this same judgment? Is it before or after 18 months, right? So if it is before 18 months, right? If they also just generally, even in this context, want one to be category noun bar, well, then they're probably using a filtering the direct evidence sort of strategy. But if instead they think it's okay, well, then that means then they probably are using this leveraging a broader set of data strategy because they said, in this context, I'm fine with one being a noun. I accept this. That's okay, right? So this is a kind of thing that we could look at in order to determine, based on our computational modeling results, what kind of representations really are there at 18 months and what strategy 18-month-old children are likely to be using to get those knowledge representations.